Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And today is Friday. For a while now, I've been treating Friday as a roundup of stories. Today, however, because I've been working on the court cards of the suit of swords throughout the week, I thought I would take today to do the last one, the King of Swords. And uh, part of the reason for this is that swords in the tarot deck um, have to deal with issues of conflict and resolution, politics, um, things that would come under the leadership heading, and therefore are relevant to our general subject matter here. I thought about, do I want to look at some of the other suits and talk about them, but that, they're really not um, relevant to the subjects we're talking about in the same way, but swords are. And so I'll remind you that on Monday we talked about the Princess of Swords and the importance of being careful in your communications. In particular, of making certain that you say what needs to be said and that you don't say what should not be said, because both of these are good ways to trip yourself up. On Tuesday, we talked about the Prince or Knight of Swords and the idea of a little healthy selfishness, the idea of self-care, the idea that you can't give away all your energy and think you're still going to have energy. Yesterday, we talked about the Queen of Swords and the importance of experience and applying the lessons of experience. Today, we're going to talk about the King. And the King of Swords is all about judgment and decision making and the ability to make good decisions. And to some extent, just the ability to make decisions. And this is a very important part of leadership, whether, again, we're talking about leading your own life or leading an organization of some sort. The ability to make decisions when decisions are necessary is a very important thing. And the ability to make halfway decent decisions is a very big important part of that too, um, because it's entirely possible to make bad decisions as well as good ones. And how do we try to ensure that we make good decisions? Well, we've already talked about some of that. We've talked about learning from experience and applying that knowledge. We have talked in other weeks about the importance of choosing your battles, of making sure if you're going to have a disagreement or a conflict of some sort, that it's worth bothering with, that there's something to be won, um, and something that could be lost by not engaging. If these are not true, then there's no point in having a conflict. And hello to April in the chat room. It's good to see you, April. And of course, as you know, if you regularly follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and they will show up here in my chat room. The Ace of Swords is the need to make a decision, the idea of decisions. The King is the ability to make good decisions. And good decisions require good judgment. They require a bit of patience. They require learning from experience. And they also sometimes require good timing. And, it's been said that the difference between a good leader and a great leader can be about 30 seconds, the length of time that they make their decisions. And hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you. But this assumes they're making good decisions. I talked the other day about why it can be a good idea sometimes to wait before making a decision or committing yourself to a decision to make sure it's what you really want to do. Because when it comes to really any situation in life, if people can involve your emotions, they often weaken your decision-making ability. And if we look at contemporary politics in the United States and elsewhere, we'll see an awful lot of attempt to get people to make their decisions purely on emotion, particularly on outrage or fear, which is at the bottom of all of it, rather than actually considering their situations. And hello to Steve Taylor in the chat room. It's good to see you. And this is true in everyday life as well. If you are making your decision as a knee-jerk response, then you want to hold off and think about it first, because knee-jerk responses are not by any means necessarily going to prove successful, particularly if you don't understand why you're having the response. Now, if you're a person who spent a lot of time in self-examination, you've done a lot of shadow work, you've done um, a lot to really get to know yourself and your thought processes, then this is a bit of a different matter. Um, you may be able to look at a situation and understand exactly why you are feeling a certain way about it. But for most people, that's not necessarily true. For a lot of people, their buttons can be pushed without their knowing which buttons were pushed. And hello to Maria in the chat room. It's good to see you, Maria. Um, Commercial advertising is famous for this. And some of the things that used to be very commonly done were how they handled gender politics in classic ads. And how if they wanted to create an impression of authority, they would have a male narrator, even if the ad was being marketed to women. Because in that generation, we're talking mid 20th century, a lot of people had the subconscious assumption that a man would be speaking with more authority. Now, hopefully, we're beyond that today, but a lot of us are not. But that's an example of how people's subconscious thoughts were used to sell them things without their realizing it. And hello to Bonnie in the chat room. It's good to see you, Bonnie. Um, the way colors are used in advertising and so forth is another example. Red is, without question, the predominant successful color for advertising. As a psychic, I can tell you, in the years when I was working psychic fairs, and hello to Mary Hawk in the chat room, uh, people would normally have flyers they would put out. And if they happened to have red lettering on those flyers, they were usually more successful. Red grabs people's attention. They don't necessarily know why. They don't even necessarily realize that it's so. But it is so. Um, and knowing that can make your advertising more successful. Now, at the same time, in the world of psychic advertising or anything where you're using basic flyers, it is not a good idea to use red paper because sometimes people would try to use red paper with black printing, thinking that red would have that same effect. It does not. Everything just kind of disappears then. But to have red lettering is very successful. When you have the title of a piece in red and the rest in black, that red will grab people's attention, even though they don't necessarily realize that this is a technique. Elsewhere in the psychic advertising world, I learned during the years that I was doing this, the most successful other thing you could do is to have your literature printed on pale blue paper. It was the color people were most likely to pick up. And pale blue, of course, is the color of communication. It's the color of the sky and often associated with spirituality. And it was very successful for psychic advertising. And I learned that by observing. But it's something to be aware of. And the people who went for that blue paper with the advertising on it, they didn't realize that it had been put on that paper for a particular reason, but it was still effective. Um, Yellow could also be, in some cases, a good color, but blue by and large was the best um, of colored papers. Now, what does this have to do with what we're saying? Well, again, your subconscious assumptions can often affect the decisions that you make if you're not aware of them. And if you look at outrage politics, you can see how this works extremely clearly. Because the idea is to get people outraged about things that often aren't really happening, but are things that are old tapes in the back of their heads, often from when they were children. And they will have a knee-jerk reaction to it, which will make them then endorse the person who has caused them to feel this fear, on the premise that they will fix it. The fact that the actual situation isn't really there doesn't come into play because they don't bother to research it because it's a knee-jerk reaction. When we talk about the ability to make good decisions, avoiding knee-jerk reactions is very important. We've talked about witch wars, I don't know how many times, and we're going to talk about them again. Um, but this is a major thing in witch wars also, or reputational warfare in general, to get people to have emotional knee-jerk reactions without really looking closely at the situation, to pick things that they're afraid of, um, and get them to react out of fear without even necessarily examining the situation. And Bonnie says emotional versus rational thinking. Exactly. If you want to be in a position of leadership, even leadership of your everyday life, you must avoid emotional thinking in favor of rational thinking when making decisions. Now, am I saying you should not pay attention to your emotions? Of course not. One of the things that is very important to understand about the 50 odd years that I have been active in the pagan community, 45 years in a position of leadership, is that for the first many of those years, there was a huge attempt on the part of spiritual people to divorce themselves from the thinking mind and focus on emotions. And this obviously, or at least I think obviously, went a little bit too far. But that doesn't mean it was a bad thing exactly in its origin, because that generation, which is the generation immediately before my own, and to some extent my own as well, were raised to discount their emotions in favor of purely rational thinking. And they were seeking to try to counterbalance that. I think they counterbalanced it too far. And I think that is responsible for some of the subsequent problems, such as the witch wars that ensued. But that doesn't mean that you don't want to be in touch with your emotions. It doesn't mean that your emotions should not be part of your thinking process, part of your decision making process, but they should not be the foundation of it. You need to be making rational decisions, which are also emotionally informed. Being alienated from your emotions is bad. But I would say being alienated from your rational character is worse. And again, looking at our national politics of the moment, for about the last 30 years, we've become increasingly alienated from rational thinking in the political arena. And this has not in any sense been a good thing. And hello to Jessica in the chat room. It's good to see you. And Bonnie says balance. Yes, we want balance. And I've often been asked over the years, um, what is special about Corellianism? And there are so many answers one can make about that. And to some extent, the answer may be generational to some extent. But to me, Corellianism has always been a resolution of opposites. It's finding a middle path. And if you look at most Correllian teachings, that's what they do. And here too, we want to find a nice middle path where we can be rational and we're making our decisions based on logic and consideration of outcome and evaluation of past experience, but not ignoring our emotions. Um, are we angry? It's perfectly reasonable in many situations to be angry and to be aware that you're angry and to recognize and to honor that you're angry without making your decision based solely on that feeling. Should your feeling of, say, anger influence your decision? Well, it kind of depends on what it is and why you're angry. I've talked occasionally about the many witch wars that we faced for so many years. And I remember one about a particular high priest whose name I will not name, who had assaulted a number of women in the Chicago community. And we were quite angry about this. And that, in my opinion, is a very appropriate situation to be angry about and to allow anger to somewhat influence your decision. Because you should be angry if someone is assaulting people. Um, but together with that, you also have to look at the situation and make sure it's true. In this case, it was in the individual I'm speaking of. And there were numerous examples, including some very prominent women. And make sure that you actually understand the situation. Um, in those same years, there was another accusation against a less prominent person, accusing them of having um, assaulted a prominent local woman in the community. And this woman was well thought of. A lot of people simply accepted the accusation as it was made, including most of the community's high priesthood at the time. And there was a huge petition running around the community to shun this person and so forth. And to my discredit, I actually signed this petition because I believe that if all these other high priesthood had signed it, surely they had looked at the situation. I would later find out that while there was a real situation involved, it was not the way it was being represented, and the entire situation was inappropriate. And I've always regretted having done that. And this is part of what I mean by saying that yes, we can pay attention to our emotions, but we must not make our decisions based on it. We must look at the situations. And yes, we should consider the emotional reaction it has on us. And this is just as true in the opposite direction. Making decisions because you um, like a person or because you want a particular outcome without looking to see if it's actually the likely outcome or not. That can lead to bad decisions too. And so, in making decisions, it's very important to keep our rational mind first, not shutting out our emotional mind, but not allowing it to dominate. And with that, I see that we are a little past halfway through our program. I want to take a moment for a message from our sponsor. And since I am back on my computer today, that should go a little more smoothly. And it should go more smoothly there. No. Where is our sponsor? There is our sponsor. And we want to thank Equinox Learning Hub, our sponsor for today and most days. And our second sponsor today is Rev Don's Metaphysical and Magic Auctions at Gaia Thrift Central at whatnot.com. and you can find a link to the upcoming auction on most of our platforms. And the next auction will be tonight, Friday the 13th, at 7 p.m. Central. And this will be a metaphysical auction of books and other items of metaphysical interest. And I think if you join us, you'll find that there are several things of unique interest to the metaphysical audience. And I am planning in my Gaia thrift offerings as I go forward to have a much stronger emphasis on metaphysics and lots of good things coming. So please join us for that. And I will also shortly be scheduling my seances for the month of October. And as you may know, in many years, I commonly do seances in the month of October, usually only in the month of October, sometimes other times. And if you're interested in taking part in that, watch for announcements coming soon. And of course, if you would like to have a reading with me, you can schedule one of those at CorellianPublishing.com. And um, there we go. Now, back in the chat room, Bonnie says, anger is a deep emotion that's often felt first. And this is absolutely true. One of the reasons that we have to be very careful of it. You know, I mentioned the other day that I like to wait. I think I said 24 hours, maybe I should really say overnight, before answering an email to which I have an emotional response, particularly if it's an anger response. And this is one of the reasons. When a situation makes you angry, that is not the moment to respond to it unless you have supreme self-control. And you know, the person who loses an argument is often the one who loses their temper. The person who loses a contest or any given situation is often going to be the one who loses their temper. And getting people to lose their temper is a technique. And going back to that manufactured outrage that we see so often in politics today, that's a technique. It gets people to lose their temper and with it lose their judgment and make certain decisions based on what the person who has caused them to lose their temper wants them to do rather than what they might actually want to do if they looked at the situation. And this is why we must be very careful about not responding to situations out of anger. We need to look at the situation, decide what is, rationally speaking, the best outcome, and go for that. Not necessarily what will give us a momentary emotional high. And yes, in that moment, making a stinging zinger, maybe the emotional high you'd really love to experience, but is it going to actually help anything? Or is it going to make it worse? Usually it's only going to make it worse. And one of the things I've observed, and I guess it's human nature, but I've observed it in the pagan community over many years, is how very often people will foul their own nest. And the witch wars were a perfect example of this, but they're not alone in that. People do this all the time. And one of the biggest reasons is when they make their judgments, they're going for that emotional high rather than considering the actual outcome of what they're doing. And you must consider the actual outcome if you want to have a decent outcome. And that is what the King of Swords is all about. Now, as in the other days that I've been examining um, the different sword suit cards, I'm also dressed in a particular chakra color. Today I'm dressed in the colors of the third eye, which is the dark indigo blue. And each day I've drawn a comparison between the chakra and the card. In terms of decision making, the third eye is all about spiritual guidance. and being open to guidance. And when our third eye is open, we're much more able to commune with our higher self and our higher powers, whether they're our spirit guides, our patron deities, what have you. And in making decisions, I think this is very important also. I think it's very important, and this is partly a result of my own life, obviously. But I think it's very important when we make decisions to not only be thinking in terms of the importance of rational thinking and outcome, but also be open to spiritual guidance and the guidance of people around you as well. When you seek out guidance from people around you, um, you have to bear in mind it won't always be good. You still have to consider it yourself. And that being the case, it's still very good to see what other people think, to see how things are affecting other people, to see what their opinions are, even if they're dead wrong. And, one of the things that I often follow, Ed the Pagan loves to ask questions on his Facebook page, and all kinds of different questions of relevance to the pagan community, but often dealing with how people feel about various aspects of the community, various aspects of power and decision making, various aspects of structure. And it's fascinating to read the answers to these questions. And as a general rule, Ed doesn't give any answers to the questions, he's merely asking them to see what people feel. And sometimes people get very frightened of these questions, which says a great deal. Um, and I think probably yesterday I was talking about how some people are very afraid to reassess their preconceived notions. We always must be willing to reassess our preconceived notions. If we can't do that, we're at a great loss for growth. If there's one constant in life, it's growth. But as I look at the answers that Ed gets to these questions, I see all kinds of different things that are important to know in terms of how the community feels. And there are certain things, and it's changed, but let's go back to the 90s for a moment, and certain things that you could assume that the vast majority of the pagan community had in common. One of them was poverty consciousness, um, and an obsession with inability to have prosperity, and a feeling on the part of many people that it was wrong to have prosperity, although they wouldn't necessarily put it in those terms. This was a huge shadow issue, and a certain amount of our community has done that shadow work and moved forward. A certain amount has not. Um, and this was a leftover, I think, from the 1960s hippie movement. But it's one of those areas where it's important in making our judgments to look at our preconceived notions, see where they came from, see if we still want them, and change them if we don't. Because poverty consciousness is not something anyone wants, in my opinion, or anyone should want, because it leads nowhere good. Um, a lot of them were also frightened of any sort of structure or leadership, which is a matter of personal choice. I think it's a very bad point of view because with no structure, once again, you're not going to get anywhere. But some of these people really didn't want to get anywhere. They just wanted to sit where they were. And I guess that's fine for them. Others went ahead and developed their structures. But regardless of how you feel about it, understanding why you feel that way and taking that into account in making your decisions is very important. So, basically, my message for today is that decision making is another very important part of leadership, making your decisions in a timely manner, but not in a knee jerk fashion, And above all, considering the things that are affecting your decisions, not taking them at face value. Are there preconceived notions that are affecting you in ways you don't understand? Are there techniques that are being used to affect you in ways that you don't understand? Try to understand them, take control of them, make a rational decision. So that's my message for today. I hope you find it helpful. Um, I will be back on Monday, and I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. And with that, we are at the end of our half hour. So let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Oh, but again, remember my metaphysical and magic auction this evening at 7 p.m. Central at Gaia Thrift Central at whatnot.com. And also this afternoon, Ed the Pagan will be doing an interview, a live interview with Harold Sanford Carter on Witchcraft TV on the subject of the Witch Wars Defense Manual Volume 2. And that should be quite interesting. So I hope you'll tune in for that as well. And now let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to keep our decisions rational and effective. Help us to remain in touch with our emotions, but also to understand them and to understand all of the influences that affect our emotions and our decisions, and to be able to use these things in proactive and constructive ways. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love, and knowing you are always with us, still we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.